them in. So welcome. My name is Roger Berkowitz. I'm the founder and academic director here at the Hannah Arendt Center at Bard College. We are getting very close to the end of reading together Hannah Arendt's The Human Condition in our virtual reading group. This is a big book, a lot of ideas in it. It's a complicated book. And I'm hoping that today a little bit and also next week when we finish the book and read the last chapter together, that we have some opportunity to sort of think synoptically about the whole book and ask some questions about what's really going on. I think it's a big enough book that reaches enough ideas that we sometimes get lost in trying to understand each particular chapter and each, there are brilliant insights throughout and problematic ones and things worth talking about. But what is it about? And I think today, leading into next week, when we finish the book, there'll be, I hope, some moments for you to gain some clarity on that. There are different thematics throughout the book, right? One is technology and science. We've talked a lot about that, automation. Another is world alienation, which is very much at the core of this final chapter, chapter 6, on the Vita Activa and the modern age, and which we will have much opportunity to talk about today. Then there's the sort of structuring of the book around the question of the human condition and the reversal from the Vita Contemplativa to the Vita Activa. And then, and this is where we really are in the book, the reversal within the Vita Activa, first from action to fabrication, and now from fabrication to the anima laborans, or laboring, or the life process. And so the first chapter that we're reading for today, our section of chapter 6, is section 43, the defeat of homo faber and the principle of happiness. To a large extent, this is a continuation of chapter 42, which we read last week, which is about the defeat, the rise of homo faber, the victory of homo faber. And so the chapter begins somewhat with a review. And the argument is that after Galileo, right, and Galileo is in many ways the beginning of all of chapter 6, even though he appears in only the second chapter of chapter 6. With Galileo, we no longer believe our senses. With Galileo, that's one aspect of the revolution that Galileo brings. We lose trust in our senses. But another is that we increasingly understand that the way we know the world is not through empiricism, whether our senses or through experiments, but through applying theories and mathematical calculations to the world. And so increasingly, the world comes inside of us, becomes introspection. And through the combination of scientific experimentation, the making of tools, and introspection, we become confident in our ability to control the world, to make the world, to fabricate the world, to make things, but to change the course of the world. And so Arendt says at the very beginning of section 43 on page 305, if one only looked at Galileo and his experiment, the loss of contemplation and its replacement with fabrication would be fairly obvious. What Galileo brought with us is the revolution in science, technology that let us think we can make the world and control the world. But she says, and so it seems fairly obvious that homo faber, this man who makes and fabricates the world, would be the highest and most meaningful human capacity in the modern age. And then she lists a whole series of reasons for that, or you could think of it a whole series of indications for the victory and predominance of homo faber, man as fabricator in the modern world. The instrumentalization of our world, both in the sense that the world is instrumental, we seek ends, but also that we use instruments that we build and create to make that. Our confidence in our tools, our belief in means ends reasoning, our conviction that every issue can be solved, the rise of the principle of utility, sovereignty, in the sense that we can make the world anew in our image, that we have that sovereign power. The importance of the natural sciences, where we create order out of disorder and we reduce the complexity of the world to comprehensible patterns. And the overarching conviction is that man is the measure of all things, and this has become a commonplace. So if that's all a commonplace and obvious and true, she asks, why does it fail? Why, in the end, is homo faber not the typical character of the human age, of the modern age? And why instead is homo faber replaced by anima laborans, man as a laboring animal? On page 306 to 307, bottom of 306 to 307, she's talking about the elevation of laboring. And, she says it was preceded by certain deviations and variations from the tradition, etc. But at the very bottom of 306 on to 307, she says, what changed the mentality of homo faber, what changed homo faber into anima laborans, in other words, was the central position of the concept of process in modernity. So here we're back at this question of process that we've spent a fair bit of time on. I want to talk a little bit about process because it is deeply important. The first, you can trace Arendt's interest in process way back in her writing, all the way to the origins of totalitarianism. For those of you who've read The Origins and with us who are on your own, excuse me, you'll remember that one of the key insights is that totalitarian regimes are movements, that they don't produce any stable government, but that they follow laws of history and nature. Freedom, thus, within totalitarian governments was not my individual freedom, right? To do what I want. It was my freedom to become part of a process, as she talks about in her description of Lawrence of Arabia near the end of the book. It was to become one with the processes and the trends that were happening in the world. To sort of, freedom meant to sort of become a part of the stream of history or part of the stream of nature. The Nazis, for her, saw freedom to become part of the stream of nature in the sense of the elevation of an Aryan race over all others, a kind of Darwinistic stream of nature, an evolutionary stream. The Bolsheviks, for her, saw the process of history in which the freedom meant to become at one with the historical unfolding of the freedom and power of the proletariat. These were this identification with totalitarianism, with the following of laws and of processes and thus the elimination of individuals and spaces that would protect an individual or unique persons from history, was, or nature, was for her the one reason that totalitarianism was so uniquely suited to the modern world, because it saw all of politics as simply part of a process or a movement that eliminated human freedom. And so, and here I think is a key important insight, that the rise of processes is seen as dangerous for Arendt, by Arendt, because it is inconsistent with what she understands freedom to be. Freedom not as a sovereign individual, but freedom as the human capacity to begin something new and to create lasting, durable, immortal stories and institutions in society. And to the extent processes deny individual lastingness and does not deny the centrality of an individual or of a lasting institution, they deny freedom. And that's really Arendt's worry about processes. So here on page 307, when she says that what changed the mentality of Homo faber was the central position of the concept of process in modernity, she now mentions three processes in this paragraph. One is consumerism, namely that with the rise of commercial society, you have the triumphal victory of exchange value over use value, and thus the relativization and devaluation of all values. There's no one value. Everything is simply just relative to its exchange value for something else. And then the other two processes, which are the two that she typically speaks of, are nature and history. The point is that man is part of, as she says, a finite processes of nature and history that don't have any telos. There's no end to them. They constantly are in motion. And every time they reach some stability, some telos, some end, well, they have to keep going. So they'll devour that end as well. So there's no higher value or meaning. There's no preordained end. As a result, Homo faber, this fabricating man, has no value to aim for in his fabrication. So she says on 307, Homo faber is deprived of, quote, those permanent measures that precede and outlast the fabrication process and form an authentic and reliable absolute with respect to the fabricating activity. So in this world of processes, Homo faber, the fabricator, the maker, has no end. And the result is that we lose, Homo faber is not the typical figure of the modern era, modern age. Without some higher end, there's nothing you can make that will last. And so what this leads to, she says, is a kind of world alienation. Everything we create that's supposed to last. Remember, the whole point of work was that it was supposed to create things that last and give us a common world, whether they're institutions or objects or artworks. And with the loss of things that last, we lose the world. And we turn from the world inside. And so she talks about ancient world alienation, in which the ancients, the Stoics and others, turned inward, but in turning inward still had some connection to the world. Versus modern world alienation, which she talks about on 310, where Puritanism, sensualism, and hedonism turn so far into one, but not only do they turn into man, but they see man as a kind of depraved being or animal, and they completely turn away from man as a lasting, valuable entity. And all they care about is pleasure and hedonism and pain, avoiding pain and pursuing pleasure. And that this full internalization into our ego and into our introspection for Arendt means that even utility now loses its meaning in the modern age, because utility still sought to create things that were useful in the world. Moving further inside, we leave behind utility, and we embrace, rather than utility, a kind of mere kind of happiness. And so on page 308, she has this discussion of Bentham, Jeremy Bentham, and the point of this discussion is that utility still presupposes that we have a world of objects, and that Bentham actually abandons the word utility to some degree. So on this footnote on page 308, she'll say the word, this is quoting Bentham, the word utility does not so clearly point to the ideas of pleasure and pain as the words happiness and felicity do. Why? Because utility still points to objects, the world. But pleasure and pain bring us, and happiness and felicity bring us fully inside our brains, fully into introspection. And so Arendt is going to argue in the end of this footnote that Bentham radically emptied the idea of utility of all reference to an independent world of use things, and thus transformed utilitarianism into a truly universalized egoism. That's the pleasure of happiness, pleasure, and pain. The principle of happiness, pleasure, and pain. And that pleasure and pain as an internal metric can then be measured with mathematical certainty or calculation. And this, for Arendt, is a further move by Bentham away from homo faber, from utility to happiness. But even this, right? Even this, she says, would not guarantee the victory of anima laborans, right? All it's going to do is say that homo faber is less victorious than we might have thought. What truly leads to the second reversal within the Vita Activa, so the reversal here of anima laborans over homo faber, is that what we're really concerned with, what Bentham was really concerned with, was not pleasure and pain even, and not utility. It was simply the survival and life. And so this is on 311, where she says in the about 2/3 of the way down the page, what pain and pleasure, fear and desire are actually supposed to achieve in all these systems is not happiness at all. It's not really about happiness, but the promotion of individual life or a guarantee of survival of mankind. And this is what she thinks really is going on with the rise of anima laborans. That what we care about more than anything else is survival and the preservation of life. And this is, of course, consequent with the loss of all other political values except one, namely human rights. Right? This is an argument that my colleague and friend Sam Moyne has made in his book The Last Utopia, and in many others as well. But his argument, what Sam Moyne's argument is in The Last Utopia, is that human rights has become the essence of modern politics, because all other political ideals, whether it be communism or socialism or authoritarianism or liberalism, all other political ideas have some end that is relative and can't be embraced generally by us anymore. Equality yes, but no. Freedom, yes, but no. Power, yes, but no. We don't fully believe in any of these political projects anymore. The only thing we today believe in is keeping people alive. And that's why, and that for Moyne is, on the one hand, the justification for human rights, but also somewhat of a condemnation of it, because it's the lowest form of politics, the lowest common denominator form of politics. If all we can agree on today politically is to keep people alive, we're not going to accomplish very much politically. We're not going to create any grand utopias or grand societies. We're not going to build anything. And that's what he thinks is happening with the rise of human rights. And underlying that is this argument of Hannah Arendt's that the victory of animal laborans is founded in the principle that life becomes the highest good. This brings us to section 44, which is called Life as the Highest Good. And what she says here is that, so far in this chapter 6, I've told this story as a history of ideas for the most part. Well, ideas and events, but science, the Archimedean point being brought inside of ourselves, introspection through philosophy, etc. But she says that's not the only reason this happened. There are other reasons too. And the real one important reason, she says on 314 or 313 to 314, she'll say the reason why life asserted itself as the ultimate point of reference in the modern age and has remained the highest good of modern society is that the modern reversal, namely the reversal of the Vita Activa, operated within the fabric of a Christian society whose fundamental belief in the sacredness of life has survived. The Christians believe that man is in God's image. And insofar as he's in God's image, he has an immortal soul. And so they sacralize life. And she goes through on page 314 to 15, actually 314 to 18, and lists all the steps of the way that this happens. So on the one hand, Jesus preaches the glad tidings that man, which formerly was the least lasting, the mortal, the least valuable thing in the universe, is now made immortal and is given an immortal soul. This, she says, brings hope to those who were doomed and hopeless. But this elevation of life is, she says, disastrous for politics, because politics strives for a worldly or earthly immortality. And now politics is made about keeping people alive, human rights, although that comes a little later, but that's the basic idea. It's all about necessity. And within this new world, there's no longer a contempt for those who want to stay alive. There's thus no longer contempt for laborers or slaves who simply want to live and stay alive. In fact, we value them, she says. Against some who would then say that the Bible is about glorifying labor, she says, no, it's not. Christianity and the Bible still valued above all contemplation as the highest form of activity. And thus, the contemplative life, the true life or the just life. But the modern age, she says, continues to operate even after contemplation has been replaced with the Vita Activa. The modern age continues to operate as if life and not the world is the highest good of man. And that is what Christianity gave to the world. That is what Christianity gave to the victory of the anima laborans. And now that we no longer live in a Christian world, she says, because we've lost contemplation and moved towards action, what matters today is not the immortality of life, but that life is the highest good. It's not the Christian doctrine of the immortal soul. It's the Christian value of life as the highest good. And that together, these two reversals, the reversal of doing and contemplating, so that doing overcomes contemplating, and the reversal of life and world, together, she says, are the point of departure for the modern world. This leads into the final chapter, which is called The Victory of the Anima Laborans, which we'll read and talk about next week. So I'm going to stop there. There are different ways that you can contribute. You can engage in the chat and talk to each other, which is always a very active and wonderful series of insights. I will call on people who raise their hands. You can raise your hands by going down to the bottom of your screen and clicking on reactions and raise your hand. And I'll call on you in the order. Please do try and keep your questions brief, as we've got a lot of people, and look forward to the discussion. So first on my list is Dina. Hi, Dina.
Hi there. So we
Hold
haven't
on,
really
Dina, I'm not
discussed
hearing
it.
you. Let me go ahead. Go ahead.
Hi there. So we haven't really discussed it very much, but these two chapters made me think of COVID a lot. And so I was wondering to what extent the pandemic and the global reaction to it, not assuming that it's monolithic, but for the purposes of the question, is an illustration of life having become the highest good, especially if you could address this question in light of the expanded role that we've seen experts take, the expanded role that models have taken, and also the fact that parts of the world have literally shut down for periods of time.
Thank you, Dina. Well, I don't know how much you know of what the work I'm doing, but that's exactly the work what I'm writing about. I taught a course on expert governance this semester, and it was centered around COVID. And I'm teaching a summer course at the Central European University in Hungary this summer on COVID and expert rule. So these are perfectly.
I didn't know that, but maybe I should take your classes.
These are the kind of questions that I think Arendt's work does bring up and should bring up. So let me frame it a couple of ways. Right back a year and a half ago, or a year and a little while ago, in March, as the first lockdowns were happening in Italy, the Italian philosopher Giorgio Agamben wrote a series of essays that some of you probably saw, because I linked to them in our Amor Mundi newsletter, arguing that the lockdowns were an illustration of what he calls bare life, and a rejection of Christian and Western values, and an elevation of keeping people alive at all costs over and against other more important human values of family, friendship, worship, community, and things of that sort. He was roundly criticized by most intellectuals, although, as I wrote in the Amor Mundi, his critique was very much consonant with Arendt in many ways, at least insofar as it makes us think about what is, when we have a pandemic and a crisis, what are our core values? Are our core values keeping as many people alive as possible, right? That's the public health mandate. Or are our core values maintaining people's livelihood and businesses, right? That's sort of the language that people like Donald Trump sometimes spoke of. The dignity of their work and keeping their livelihood and their ability to continue to live in a public world and an economic world and have what they've built and striven for their whole lives not ruined. Or are our public values to be able to console our loved ones, be with those who are dying, and attend funerals of those who die, and assert the absolute value of living in a shared moral and ethical world, as Agamben wrote in his critique. You know, I think you said is, you know, I think the way I see it is that what COVID has done, in a way that's been happening for a few decades, but I think COVID made it clear to most, is bring about a real fundamental cleavage in our society between those who fully accept the expert mandate to pursue life and justice at all costs, versus those against those in our society who are not yet quite enlightened enough, and I'm using that somewhat ironically, I hope you see, to understand that their values, whether they be values of work and dignity or values of community and ethics, should be sacrificed to the ultimate value of life and justice. And so I do think the COVID crisis is, and the ways in which at least the mainstream institutions of our society and the educated and enlightened elements of our societies fundamentally and fully embraced the ideal of the preservation of life as the highest common and public good, is a perfect illustration of at least the thesis that Arendt announced 60 years ago, the victory of animal laborans and the victory of the principle of life as the highest good. It's clearly not fully spread throughout society. There are pockets of resistance throughout the world, and we saw that. And in many ways, and so part of the project that I'm working on is actually arguing that the real political polarization of our time is not based in race, not based in gender, not based in any of those things, but is based in our fundamental orientation towards experts and expert rule. And there's a largely educated class of people who fundamentally believe in and will follow and find authority in expert-driven rule. And there's another really largely class-based group that doesn't. And to me, that's the real divide that is currently defining much of our politics around the world. So yeah, I think you're absolutely right to point to that to the COVID crisis as an illustration of this. But what do you think, Dina?
I think that I don't know about experts, because I think both sides use them, and so I don't know about that. But I think the use of models is very much in line with what Arendt is saying here. This idea of is actually another form of the process that she's discussing here in this chapter, which does have a deleterious effect on freedom. Maybe not in the way that it's cast by people like Trump and so forth, but in a totally different way, maybe in an Arendtian way, in the sense that it's difficult to create new if the future is dictated by whatever model, predictive value of a model.
Yeah. I think both of those are good points. I mean, you're absolutely right that both sides have experts. this is part of the work, and it's what's called by someone named Gil Leal, whose book right here is called The Crisis of Expertise. Is all about that. It's about how the fact that both sides have experts undermines experts and devalues them. And that's been going on, he argues, since the early 20th century. And it's true. And yet there's still a deep, deep desire to hold on to the authority of expertise because we don't have anything else. The fear is that if we lose expertise, because if we lose expertise, we don't have expertise, we don't have religion, we don't have truth, we don't have rationality. We fall into what the English philosopher William Davies calls nervous states, where everything simply becomes about propaganda and persuasion, which is where he thinks we're headed. And he may be right. We haven't yet fully given up on experts. There's still a desire to think that there are, even though there are different experts and both sides have their experts, people still want to believe that there's a consensus of experts, right? So whether it's on climate change or on COVID, there's a deep desire to think that even though some experts disagree, there's a general consensus. And to some degree, that's true. And so I think both of those things can be held together, the crisis of experts and the need for experts.
Roger, can I say something about the expert? This is Mara calling. I mean, there were some experts in the medical field during the COVID crisis that were actually putting out the expertise in the safety, of course, the medical safety of opening schools. I'm sorry, I'm bringing up, this debate, again, but not with the function of preserving life, but on the contrary, more along the lines of the values that Agamben was putting forward, right? The kids with other kids, supporting their community and their growth and togetherness, as part of this equation. So I see what you mean about the experts, but as you said, they're not a monolith. And I think that particularly in view of, the debate around the opening of schools, they play a major role, not for life in itself, even though, of course, that was a cure, but for other values along Agamben's lines.
Yeah, of course, Mara, and not all experts agree, and there are different kinds of experts, and we've talked about this in different sessions. Experts in housing law will tell you we can house everyone in the world. All we have to do is this, this, and this. The problem is that conflicts with experts in ethics, or it conflicts with experts in environment. And each expert thinks that, they can solve whatever problem it is. But the problem is that they see the world through their prism of expertise. In this particular case, we were in a public health emergency. So there were education experts who came out and said, well, actually, education is another value in addition to funerals and community and ethics and economics. And, to some degree, they were heard over time. But let's remember, there were also experts who came out and said, look, this pandemic is not as contagious as people think. Some experts said that. Some experts, and there were calls for, and in fact, it did happen that things like groups like Facebook and Twitter censored these experts, some of whom with Nobel Prizes behind their names, and labeled them fake news, other things like that. I don't want to get too caught up in the politics of this, but there were differences of opinions, of course, and as people talked about it, things changed. But I think all I was trying to say, based on Dina's question, was if you look at the overarching trend and way and response to the pandemic across the world, I mean, China being at the highest end, and Brazil maybe being at the lowest end, you'll see that there was an enormous consensus around the world that the primary goal was to keep as many people alive as possible. That was the highest goal. It wasn't the only one, but it was the highest one. And I think that's, to me, an incontrovertible fact, observing the world in the last 16 to 18 months. And I think that's an illustration of what Arendt has to say.
Yeah,
How?
I absolutely agree. Okay.
Oh, yeah, go ahead, Mara.
No, I was going to say that I absolutely agree. I absolutely agree. I think that the second most important debate in the US, not in other countries, certainly not in Europe, you know, had to do with this point that I'm making about the open school debate, in which the experts actually act together with others in a movement, in a very kind of originating power and togetherness, you know, way for other values. And I think that that is important to highlight, that that is possible as well, you know, because this is exactly what happened. You know, I was part of there, and I was very much inspired, you know, by, you know, Arendtian understanding of politics and generating movement, but definitely what led the movement forward necessarily was tied to the experts' view of other values beyond life in itself for the kids. That's all. I'm gonna stop here.
Great.
Thanks.
Yep. Thank you. Hal, you're up next.
Yeah, no, this is something that I've been thinking about, which was related to something you just said, which said a bit ago, was the idea of utopia, because usually, and people often invoke the specter of totalitarianism, and of course Arendt's other work, to kind of attack the idea of political ambition in general. And as well as, of course, Arendt herself is very skeptical of utopia. And that's been one of the causes behind the rise of kind of human rights being the last thing that's kind of the only thing we can agree on, because ambition is considered something that's bad. However, at the same time, of course, Arendt's also against political utopia and against totalitarianism. So, like, I mean, I guess the question is, like, where would politics be then? Because I mean, it doesn't seem like she's a fan of this kind of bare life critique of this bare life idea of politics, or a fan of this very like lockdown form of liberalism, where like where we really can't have any sort of political ambition at all. But she also is she's also critical of the idea of utopia. So I just don't understand where, I mean, Slavoj Žižek actually, his book, Does Somebody Say Totalitarianism, kind of discusses totalitarianism as an idea, as almost like a sort of cancel culture against the idea of a politics of changing the world. So I just don't know where like Arendt would actually be aligned here.
Thanks, Hal. Yeah, I don't think, so I think that while Arendt is suspicious of utopianism, in the sense that utopianism thinks there's a theory of a just society that we can realize, she's not suspicious of and not against grand political projects. I think that's an important distinction. I mean, revolutions, right, which are grand political projects, are you know, something she finds incredibly meaningful. And I think that the way to understand the difference is that what she is open to and believes is important are politics that aim to create lasting institutions of freedom. Thus, the word that I think would help you is immortality. For her, politics has to aim at immortality. It has to aim at things that are not only that are worth lasting and thus are great. That doesn't mean immortality is not the same as utopia. great institutions, be it the Athenian polis or the United States Constitution, just to use two that she sometimes speaks of, are not utopias. They're compromises. They're built on institutions that developed over time, and out of conversation and discussion and give and take. They don't represent any one particular ideological victory, but they are grand and great political achievements and projects that have had an immortal and lasting impact on our political world. And so I don't think the suspicion of utopia in any way militates against grand political projects. It just militates against ideological and utopian political projects, not against grand political projects. Does that make sense to you, Hal?
I mean, I guess what would be defined as how would you end up defining what was utopian versus what was grand? I mean, is that almost in the eye of the beholder to a certain extent? Because she seems to conceive of ideology as kind of being a systematized form of thinking. So I guess as long as it was like a non-systematized form of grandness or greatness, that would not be ideological. Or
well, yeah, I mean, she thinks, yeah, I mean, it's not in the eye of the beholder. I think that's not right. I think it's what you said second. I mean, for her, politics is about persuasion and about people coming together and finding what they share and building a common world based on that. It's not me imposing my view on other people who disagree with me. A utopia, generally, is one that exists no place. It's an idea. And the idea, is to impose my utopia on everyone else, whether they want it or not. And that's what ideological politics is about. And that's what she finds scary and dangerous about utopian politics, is that you believe in what you believe in, whether it's liberalism or Marxism or capitalism, so fully that if people disagree with you, you're willing to kill them or, force them to accept it. That's what she calls political utopianism. And what she finds, positive in other forms of government that emerge out of compromise and from the bottom up, not the top down, is their non-utopianism, that they're practical, that they are aimed to create consensus from the bottom up. And that's her form of politics. All right, Alex.
Hi, Roger. Hi, everybody.
Hi.
I'm really liking this discussion because I think it's helping me voice a question that I've had throughout our reading, and I'm gonna try to spell it out. I hope it's gonna make sense. But I guess I'm wondering about the way that this idea of greatness that Arendt has sits with her commitment to plurality. And so, when you were talking about the response to COVID, and for me, it was hard not to hear this kind of view in the background that, it's okay to let, people suffer, or whoever needs to die, let that happen for the sake of something like greatness or something like, maintaining a certain standard. And, there are extremes of this view, right? Like Nietzsche is a good example. People, large classes of people can be means to the end of some kind of greatness or some kind of the great man or the great human being. And and it's not hard to hear those kinds of tones in Arendt as well, right? In certain places. At the same time, though, she has the commitment to plurality. And I'm just curious how those two things sit together, because it seems like it's pretty uneasy at times. And how do we make sense of, on the one hand, seeking some kind of greatness and immortality, on the other hand, living in a world of plurality where there are others, and where the whole of the people, the individuals really matter. And I'm having a hard time seeing that.
Yeah, thanks, Alex. So first of all, I'll start with the easy part because it's a good question and most of it's not easy. Arendt is not Nietzsche, and she's not Marx. So, you said it's sort of easy to hear in what I said and maybe in Arendt, a kind of let's sacrifice certain people to a greater end. A means end kind of reasoning. And I don't think that can be found in Arendt at all. There's no justification in Arendt for saying, let's sacrifice, these people for some higher end. I don't see that. But there is in Arendt a recognition that some people might sacrifice themselves for higher end, and that we as a collective may decide that it's more important to pursue some ends than keep everyone alive. I mean, the first place this ever comes up not the first place, I'm sorry. But in Eichmann in Jerusalem, when Arendt talks about the Unileta, the Council of Jews who over and over again cooperated with Eichmann in order to save some Jews and gave others to Eichmann in order to be orderly transported without a lot of manpower to their deaths. Arendt is really critical of that. And she's critical of it for a number of reasons. One, that they often save their friends and family at the expense of others, so means and rationality. But also because what she says is, in order to keep some people alive, they sacrificed the majority. But more than that, if they had just created chaos, in all likelihood, fewer people would have died. And she has some studies that some Dutch social scientists had done to show that probably was the case. The point is that even in her writing on Eichmann in Jerusalem, she's making a similar point. It's not a means to end, but she's saying that we should be skeptical of sort of expert-driven or elite-driven solutions that try and put life as the highest good. I don't think what I was saying, and I don't want to confuse what I was saying with what Arendt is saying. I don't think that what I was saying is that we should sacrifice X people for some greater good. It was that in a plural society, right, we have to find what it is that we share and that we value, what makes us Germans or Americans or Brazilians or Chinese or whatever it is. And what's interesting is that around the world, there was an incredible agreement amongst the leaders that the highest values of our societies were life. And yet within some of our societies, especially the ones that are more open to plurality, other voices were heard. I mean, this is what Mara and others were saying, right? That there were other values, be they economic or educational or spiritual or familial. And I guess what I was trying to say is that in a plural society, we should be able to hear and acknowledge those values, and not impose one value to rule them all. And to be honest, I mean, to some degree in the United States, that happened over and against the will of many in the public health community, and many, of us intellectuals who largely supported the public health community. It's one of the reasons so many people died. And yet many of them died. Some of them died, I mean, there's a lot of reasons, but the point is, I think that it was not a group of people deciding to sacrifice another group of people. It was people having different values and pursuing different values amidst a pandemic, and at least a organized minority, if not a majority of people in certain countries, including the United States, saying, look, we want to be safe, but we don't want to be safe at the expense of every other value we have. And I think that was why it was so contentious here. So I think the plurality of the country was very much witnessed to the chagrin of, I think, the public health establishment. I think I've answered your question, Alex. Tell me what you tell me what you think.
Yeah, thanks, Roger. Yeah, one thing I would want to, I see what you're saying about Arendt and her not being Nietzsche, also not being Marx. I guess that's a good sort of way of kind of mapping maybe what she's saying in a way. One thing I do want to challenge in the analysis of the response to the pandemic, I'm not sure that the response that you're talking about necessarily reflects just the primacy of life and nothing else. I would want to argue there may be different ways of reading the response. So, for example, it's well known that COVID affects certain groups of people a lot more than others, right? And it tends to be vulnerable groups of people, right? Like the elderly, people with health conditions, people living in places of high density, places without good access to healthcare, and so on. And I think there's an argument to be made that the response to COVID, I think it could be read as the value of those voices. That those voices that are vulnerable and often are not heard, that those voices should be heard. So, I think the point about life is also important, but I would say there's something about plurality there, in the kind of urgency that we had, that many places had about COVID, and that kind of rhetoric was often used. Where I am in Canada, it was emphasized that, it is the elderly who are at stake here, right? And the elderly they're not politically involved very much. They're not very vocal. And so I think that reading is pretty plausible too.
Yeah, thanks, Alex. I'll accept it to some degree. First of all, I'll say, at least in the United States, the elderly are quite political. I think they're the most highly politicized demographic. I will also say that while I think you're right that rhetoric was often used by the public health establishment, in my experience, personally and from what I witnessed around, it was not widely used by the elderly. Most elderly people I know wanted to see their kids and their grandkids. Certainly my parents did, I'll tell you that much. And they were willing to risk something in order to see their kids and their grandkids. Now, again, some people may not, but there's always a balance, but the rules against visiting people in the hospital and in nursing homes and having funerals certainly are not supported by the elderly people I know. In fact, they found them to be really wrong. Now, so I guess what I'd say is I think that rhetoric was used, but it was used more strategically by the public health community, at least in my experience, than by the elderly. And obviously, there's going to be some who disagree with me, and I'm sure a lot of elderly also believed it. I think a lot of elderly wanted what a lot of people wanted, to make their own decisions and not be told, and to be able to judge whether they should see their grandkids or not, and to not have it be legally prescribed by a politician or a public health bureaucracy. But I could be wrong, and I'll at least acknowledge that you're right that there was an ethic of care that was at least mobilized, but a care, again, in the name of keeping as many people alive as possible.
Hi, Roger. Can I just jump in and since we're having this conversation about the COVID and how experts handled it and so on, what about Sweden? You know, how Sweden approached the whole pandemic very differently, at least in the majority of the beginning. What were your thoughts on that relative to your analyses?
Yeah, no, a number of countries approached it in different ways. I mean, China obviously approached it in a complete, after a month or two. I mean, in the most public health lockdown, straying forward that we could never have done, I think, in a democratic country like ours, or in many. Sweden obviously went in a different direction. They read a different, they sort of brought in a different group of public health people who thought you could create herd immunity and things of that sort. I mean, I know I followed, there was a couple months when Sweden was doing very well and people were holding up as an example. And then there were a couple months when it was doing very badly and people were holding it up as a failed example. I don't know where it ended up. I have to say I lost track of that.
Right. I mean, from what I see, how what happened with Sweden is it might be a country where they in fact didn't value the human life over other values, like education and economies and people's livelihoods. So they lost a lot of people. They
did. I think they lost a lot of people. I don't know. I haven't seen anything about Sweden in the last 6 months or so. I don't know how many people more they lost than here, for example, percentage wise. I just, but you're right. I think that's the choice they made. I don't know if they feel good about that choice or not. And again, I'm not saying we made the wrong choice or the right choice. I'm simply, the real point I'm trying to make is that we made a choice driven by a logic that Arendt analyzed 65 years ago about the principle of life. And most countries did. And I think you're right to say Sweden was an outlier in that. Although I actually think that to some degree, Sweden's choice was driven by a public health analysis that they would create herd immunity and it would in the end not be worse off than other countries. I don't know if in the end that turned out to be true or not. I just haven't looked at the numbers in the last 6 months. Have you? I mean, do you know?
Like yourself, I haven't checked in a couple months, but it seemed from the last time that I checked earlier in the year, they lost a significant amount of people compared to other similar countries of their sort.
Do other people know what the end up? Has anyone seen a recent analysis of what happened in Sweden?
I don't know what their actual results were, but I do know the fact that their argument always was couched within the framework of this will cause no more deaths. So they were still, no matter how many more deaths or less deaths they actually recorded, they were still operating within the mental framework of preserving life, I think.
Yeah, I mean, that was their argument. They were making a public, I mean, I remember that pretty clearly. But I just don't know how it worked out for them.
The politicians were heavily criticized later on for not doing more than they did, actually, because they heard on this expert. It was an expert who decided everything in Sweden and not the politicians. And they were blamed for this. Another thing is how the healthcare for elderly in Sweden is organized by a lot of people who didn't get paid if they left work. So that was some critical voices against how they had structured the healthcare there as well. But mainly it was they listened to experts and the politicians were blamed afterwards. That's the latest I know about this.
Mm-hmm. Okay. Well, we can all do some research on our own afterwards. Yeah, I mean, I just don't know where it's at. I mean, yeah, I'm not gonna say anything else until I look at the facts. So, Ahmed.
Yes, I had to unmute myself. My question is kind of maybe complicated. It's how do we fit Arendt's narrative about the elevation of the value of life with Foucault's story about biopolitics? You know, a complication is that obviously they have different notions of power. For Foucault, power is a descriptive term, whereas for Arendt, power has some, it's normative, right? Power is when we act in concert. So there's a complication there, but if we can get behind, past that, how do we reconcile or not? How do these two stories fit in with each other? I mean, Foucault's general idea is that biopolitics is kind of the latest evolution of a kind of non-sovereign disciplinary power, you know, a power that doesn't like to be seen, a power that likes techniques over actual ideas. It's exercised, it's decentralized, it's exercised by experts and managers, not by sovereigns, and so forth. So it's already kind of pretends to be apolitical. And which, yeah, I don't know, can both stories be true at the same time? Is it, is Arendt actually here being a philosopher, although she says she's a political theorist, and Foucault is the political theorist in this case, or is there some other way to reconcile those two stories?
Thanks, Ahmed. I don't know if you saw a couple of weeks ago, or I posted a thing about Foucault and biopolitics and Amor Mundi. It was I forget who wrote it. Maybe someone can quickly look it up and put it in the chat.
It was related to Jeff Schollenberger, like
right.
his works, but I think it was Ross Douthat's New York Times article.
Well, no, I didn't. I had read Ross's, but I didn't. I posted something by Jeff Schollenberger. Schollenberger has been making an interesting point in recent writing about the sudden abandonment of Foucault by sort of the sort of educated the educated elite, and how he had been for many years, you know, so popular, and suddenly seems to be losing popularity. And Ross Douthat picked up on this in the New York Times, and and the reason Schellenberger is suggesting is that Foucault's argument about biopower is deeply critical of experts and expert governance and disciplinary powers of whether it's medical experts or economic experts or others, and that the left, the political left, and largely the university left, has become so beholden to these discourses of power of the expert and managerial classes that they have suddenly found Foucault to be embarrassing. The other, the one person on the left who makes this argument, and unfortunately just died a couple months ago, not by COVID, but died, is David Graeber. If you read David Graeber's work, he is scathing in his critiques of Foucault, precisely on these grounds, that he thinks Foucault, is caught up in a kind of elevation of bureaucracy. So on this level, Ahmed, Foucault could be, depending on how you read Foucault, right, could be seen as descriptively, talking about the power of experts, or he could be seen as critical of it. I think Arendt is also critical of experts. It's the last 6 or 7 years of her writing life. It's one of the main themes of her writing is the danger that experts pose to politics. But I think for different reasons and in different ways, I do think that the elevation of life, the narrative of the elevation of life that you've talked about, is one that Foucault sees and describes in his biopolitics. It's also one that Giorgio Agamben sees and describes and rebels against in his writing and his critique of bare life. And in that sense, I think Agamben and Arendt are a little closer to each other than Foucault. Does that sound right to you, Ahmed? Or do you want to say more? Or are you looking for more?
Yeah, maybe it's simply what I just wrote in the chat. Maybe it's the elevation of life had to come first in order to enable the exercise of biopolitics.
Yeah, I mean, I think with biopolitics, we got the word bio, but I mean, biopolitics for Foucault can serve many different ends, right? It can serve disciplinary ends. It can serve economic ends. I'm not as much of a reader of Foucault as I imagine you are, Ahmed. I'm not sure if biopolitics has to serve in the end life. I mean, that's how Agamben takes it in the end. That's how Arendt takes it in the end. Is that also how Foucault takes it?
Well, I'm just saying that it rhetorically permits biopolitics to function because you're saying you are working, the experts who are exercising this power, they're dependent on the assumed, primacy of the value of life. Therefore, you're even going to listen to them in the first place because you've already taken, the value of life as a given.
I think that's fair. I'll accept that.
I mean, obviously, the Nazis reverse it, in which they're protecting the body politic from, an outside, disease, that they're protecting. But yeah.
Okay, I'll accept that. All right, Robert.
I'm going to try and ask a question that's more theoretical than we've been talking. I found this chapter to be the most disconcerting and least insightful of the book. And the reason I think has to do with two things. First of all, her notion of the modern age seems to me not to hang together at all. It's based on such scanty points of attention and on such inaccuracy. For example, what she says about Bentham and the principle of utility, that there's nothing left. The second and maybe broader question has to do with what struck me in this chapter, especially hard, that she's giving a historicist account of the modern age, or indeed the contrast between ancient and modern. By historicist, I mean in the tradition of Hegel's phenomenology, the notion that you can talk in terms of stages of human development, each with their own barely described characteristics, say something intelligent or useful on that basis. I mean, that's the aspect of Hegel that ruined what Marx had to say. And it seems to me, here's another example. The second-rate sophist Alistair MacIntyre. It seems to me Arendt is on the border of falling into that kind of thing. Okay, I'll stop.
Second-rate sophist Alistair MacIntyre. Wow. Yeah. I just taught MacIntyre's book this semester, After Virtue, which I like quite a lot. But that shows I'm a second-rate sophist. No, I'm just kidding. I take your points, Robert, to be that you're suspicious of periodization and stages of development and things of that sort. And I don't think Arendt is interested in stages of development, but I think she does and is interested in illustrative characteristics and illustrative examples that she thinks mark certain epochs or ages. So there's no doubt that she believes that the modern age is one defined by the value of life above all other values. When you say that there's scanty evidence or inaccuracies, I guess one question is, do you disagree with her that the modern age is an age that values life above all other values, and that's something new in the world?
I thought what she had to say about Christianity informing that or being the background for that attitude was actually right on target. I shouldn't say Christianity, I should say Judaism plus Christianity, as she eventually does.
Okay, but I guess the point is, we can look at each. I mean, I don't want to go into the weeds too deeply here. We can look at what she says about Bentham. We can look at what she says about the Stoics. What else? We can look at what she says about I mean, I don't know, what is it that you found scanty and inaccurate? The one you mentioned was Bentham. Um,
Well, can I answer?
yeah.
The entire focus on Galileo's building a telescope as defining the modern age. The modern age is, hundreds of times more complicated than that.
Yeah, but
That's
Robert,
only one.
Robert, let me just interrupt for a second. I mean, first of all, Galileo's telescope was. Oh, when you're saying the chapter, you mean chapter 6, or you mean one of these sections 43 or 44?
No, I mean the whole of chapter 6.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay, I had misunderstood that. So it's obviously a longer argument. Yeah, I mean, again, she is not in any way saying that Galileo's telescope defined the whole of modern age. She's saying that if you can find in one event, you can, in this one event, you can see a whole host of very complicated things come together, and that the actual event of the telescope illustrated it to people and allowed it to be seen by people in a mass way that hadn't been beforehand. Even the telescope, however, only inaugurates the modern age. It doesn't inaugurate what she calls the modern world, which doesn't happen until the landing on the moon or the dropping of the atom bomb, depending on which text of Arendt's you read. But these are, I mean, just, I don't know how important it is. I don't want to get into the argument about the telescope or the atom bomb or the landing on the moon. I mean, these are for her.
Is the modern age?
The modern age is an age of science, and it's the age of the internalization of the world and mathematication of the world. But for her, it doesn't impact most people as long as it remains an elite discourse. It only begins to impact the world when it becomes widely disseminated, which doesn't really happen until the atom bomb or the landing on the moon, or, again, these are just two events, but the more general popular consumption and understanding of science, which she thinks doesn't really happen until the mid 20th century and later. Yeah, I mean, when you make a grand gesture like she's making, the modern age, the modern world, you can of course be criticized for saying, oh well, it started earlier or it started later, or you're forgetting this, you're forgetting that. And I mean, it's very, I think, easy to challenge her on some of these things if that's what you want to do. I'm not going to defend these as absolute periods or as events that everything changed right then and there. I don't think that's her argument. I think the argument is that these are fulcrum points that allow you to see fundamental changes. So what I would say to you, in the end, Robert, is, do you agree in the end that she has shown something meaningful, which is that that the values of our world have shifted from contemplation to action, and then from action to creating, and then from creating to keeping people alive? And she then has a whole argument about why that's happened, right? Part of it's world alienation, part of it's introspection, part of it's Christianity and the value of life. You have all these arguments, but I guess in the end, if you're going to say that it's the least insightful, do you think in the end?
I
she did
would.
right? So, I'm your connection as often is not very good, Robert. I don't know what to tell you. Are you there?
Uh,
All right, Catherine, I'm going to go to Catherine. Robert, I mean, if you, I just can't hear you. I don't know if you're trying to talk.
no, I don't. I think it's vastly oversimplified.
Okay. Catherine.
Oh. No, I don't. I don't think she is. I don't think she's right.
Okay. I can't, Robert, the problem is we can't hear you,
Yeah.
right? So I'm going to ask you to maybe type it in the chat because I can't hear you. All right, Catherine, can you go on? Catherine?
Yeah. Yeah. So I feel like this is like the most basic question ever. And I feel like we've actually talked about this before. Like I feel like you've prepped us for this question. But one of my favorite ever professors used to say that repetition was the key to learning. So I feel like this insight into human life as the highest value is interesting. And I don't know, I'm like losing my thought as I'm trying to get it. Apologies. It is, and I think the fact that my reaction to it is like, duh, kind of says a lot, you know, like that like maybe she's on to something. But I'm like, and I know we don't really do value judgment further. So my first question is, what is wrong with that? I want to push back on it because I don't think she acknowledges, and it surprises me the way she doesn't acknowledge some lives are the highest value. I think it would be very like, and that lots of people have different opinions about which human lives are valuable. I don't think everyone values all of humanity and all life. And I think the pandemic shows that. But like, why is that bad? What should be the highest value anyway? And my guess is that for her, it has something to do with freedom and like that, like freedom in action. And she defines freedom differently. But the other thing that makes me hiccup is, especially in like justice movements, like life and freedom are very much equated. And I know that she talks about freedom in a different way, but it's like, how can you have it? Almost I feel like kind of well-intended liberal justice folks would say, well, it has to revert to life being the highest value. And then once we have agreed that life is the highest value, then we can go on to things being important. And then we can go on to these, you know, it's like, we got to start at the bottom rung and build up. Anyway, I just like, why is that bad? And yeah, I don't know. Like
Okay.
back to that like base thing. Well, like, so
So
I don't know if that's at all helpful.
So yeah, so right, why does this book, The Human Condition, which seems so rich and complicated and so, you know, full of insights, end with what Catherine says is a so what, and what Robert says is, you know, not very insightful. That's a good question. You know, I to the extent we say it's not very insightful, and so what, it shows, I think, as Catherine, I think, implied, we sort of accept it. We largely agree with her that life is the highest value. Obviously, she's suggesting that this represents a real change in the human condition, right? Not in human nature, to come back to some basics, but in the human condition. That today to be human is very different than it was at other times. And that the whole effort of the book is to think what we are doing and to think about this difference and this change. It's not to say it's wrong or bad or good, it's to think it through. And I think your instincts are right, Catherine. She has some serious questions about it. You know, and you're right that it's around questions of things like freedom, politics, and meaningfulness. I think the so what, if you want to put a point on it, is that we have lost that the human condition, as it's emerging in the modern world, in which life is the highest value, has become meaningless. Right? That's her argument, or increasingly meaningless. I don't want to say fully meaningless. But to the extent that life is the highest value, why do we live? Why are we here? You know, we've given up religion. That's no longer an issue. We've given up family. We've given up truth. We've given up justice. If we care, if the highest good is life, why? Why go through all the hazards and hell? Is it really worth it? And this comes back to her, critique in chapter 9 of the Origins of Totalitarianism of Human Rights, which is that human rights puts life as the highest value. And she says it treats humans like animals. It doesn't acknowledge what is truly human, which is the need to and the ability to matter in the world, to be meaningful, to act and speak in public in ways that matter. And that's in many ways where I think she's thinks we're headed, and she thinks it's a making shallow of what it means to be human. And so she's pointing that out. So are some, you said that some lives are worth more. I mean, clearly in the COVID crisis, I mean, people in our political world, if the goal is keeping people alive, some people have more power than others, and they're going to be able to pull the system to keep them alive longer than others. And so you're right. We don't treat all lives equally, but the point is that the driving value is still keeping people alive, life. I don't think she's saying we should kill people. She's not. I mean, she's not saying we don't want life, but she is saying, as she says many times, that part of being a human is dying, and dying well. This is me, not her, but this is the contradiction in the whole argument around healthcare as a human right. I mean, the whole premise of healthcare as a human right seems to be that people have the right to an infinite amount of healthcare to keep them, alive forever. It seems to mistake the very idea of what a human life is. And from Arendt's point of view, human life is not staying alive as long as you can. It's living well, and living well while you're alive, and then dying. And dying is part of life. And part of the one consequence of the value of human life above everything else is that we have this incredible desire to avoid death and to deny the dignity of death and the meaning of death. There's a great book by my friend Shai Levi called The Modern Art of Dying, which is about this. And it's about how, in certain periods, death was an art, and how people sought to die well, but that in the modern age, we've sought to live as long as we can. And to the extent we're going to die, the one premise is to die with as little pain as possible in hospice and other things. And we've emptied dying of its humanity, except insofar as it should be pain-free, as if we're an animal. So if that's the so what, as I understand it, it may not be enough, but that's how I understand the so what.
But I feel like there is something in the premise that is like, I don't know what I think of it all yet, but there is some fodder for being like, just the notion that yes, we do value life, right, for all the reasons and all the things that you've said. And what are we, maybe just seeing that that's what we value, and then what are the downsides of that? Because I think that we do live in an age where we don't often think about what are the downsides of valuing life. Or like, yeah, it's just the like, okay, so now what? And what is this?
Yeah. I think that's right. In one level.
So, like I take it very well. Like yeah.
All right, Catherine, you're also Catherine, you're also breaking up. I can't, and I haven't been able to understand what you're saying. So I'm gonna let that go as a comment. I think you're right that there are some aspects of the one part of it is simply making us aware of this and making us question it. Okay. I realized I skipped Anthony, and I don't know why, but I apologize, Anthony. So let me go back to you.
Thank you, Roger. Thanks for this discussion. I've gotten a lot out of this book. So I just have two comments to make. One, as a human scientist, I'm a sociologist by disciplinary training, but I don't know, I've been concerned about, and I know work's been done on this, it seems what Arendt's, I would call it sort of a derogation of the human sciences as focusing on human beings as objects, sort of part of like an instrumentalization process. So certainly as true, more true of the natural sciences, but also of the human sciences. So I would like to sort of push back on that argument, if I've captured it accurately, that I'm reminded of Weber's distinction, which I'm sure Arendt was very familiar with, between sort of Zweck-rational action, right, means-ends action, and Werth-rational, or which is more teleological, right, value-oriented action. So I don't know, I go back to sort of, I guess, Ecclesiastes, right? There's a season for everything. So it just seems to me that what the human sciences can do is to provide us with an understanding of the conditions of human existence, how society's organized, why we behave the way we do, what are the patterns of behavior. And then I think we need to enter into political talk, right? Are we satisfied with those patterns and those arrangements? And that's where we would develop those values, right? We would shift into a Werth-rational mode. And then once we decide on our values, then I think the how comes into play again. How are we going to realize them? Based on an understanding of human behavior. So I don't know if this is making sense, but I think there's a role to play for the human sciences, but it just seems they seem to be dismissed as part of this instrumentalization of life. And I'm thinking of Etzioni, the active society, right? Think of society as like a steamboat. Well, we have to decide where we're going, right? What's the port of destination? Politics plays a major role, but then, right? But then there is a role, to go back to the previous discussion, there's a role for expert knowledge. What's the best way to achieve that? And that's where you then go into like a how mode, right? Which hopefully the human sciences can contribute to that kind of a I don't know if that made any sense, but
Yeah. Thanks, Anthony.
so I have a second point, but maybe I'll just focus on this for now. So
Okay.
Right.
Yeah, I mean, Arendt is skeptical of the social sciences or the human sciences in their ability to offer an account of human action, for a simple reason, which is that what the sciences study is what people have done, and then try and take from what people have done and develop laws that explain human behavior, whether it's supply and demand, or the pursuit of power, or whatever it is, and or whether it's Stanley Milgram's law that people obey authority. And she thinks that these laws that social or human scientists develop from interpreting past human actions and through experiments or through other things, are always going to be inaccurate, which is almost by definition. And a good scientist knows that, because they're always going to cut off the extremes, and they're going to develop a theory, and those theories may be right or may be wrong. And insofar as we use these laws to organize society and develop society, we cut off the possibilities for other ways of being, and we restrict freedom, and we tell people who act outside of these laws that they are abnormal, or they are criminal, or they are problems, deviants, whatever you want to call it. So she doesn't believe that. She fundamentally doesn't believe that theories about human behavior can be accurate, because she thinks that humans are free. And she thinks that social science denies that freedom. I think it's not only, she's not unique in this critique. It's a critique that many people make, including Alistair McIntyre, who was mentioned earlier. But many people make this critique of the social and human sciences.
So I would just say there are two questions there. Can the human sciences, if done well, and we could just debate what that means, but can the human sciences inform collective judgments in the realm of politics? I would say yes. And number two, can the human sciences play a role in implementing collective judgments that are made? And I would say yes to both, if done well. But she seems to be not open to either possibility. And
that's not. I don't think that's fair. She certainly reads, sociologists and reads political scientists and reads economists. It's not like she ignores them. She thinks they certainly provide insights. She has worries about them. One is the one I mentioned. Another is that, as as we become more and more convinced that we can predict human behavior, she thinks that's one of the reasons fewer and fewer people act, because they think that it will be taken care of by scientists and experts, and it leads to a kind of passivity. She thinks that the law of large numbers, which we read about earlier in the book, will lead to the fact that as we believe we know what people think, people will start to think what everyone thinks, and it will lead to a kind of conformism. Again, none of this is to say we shouldn't have social scientists. I don't think she would never say that, and I don't think she would ever say that. And she does, and certainly she thinks some social scientists do their jobs very well. And she reads them. I mean, Max Weber, David Reifman, who wrote The Lonely American, David Reif. Reisman, yeah. So she certainly reads social scientists, and she values ones that she thinks offer insights. So this is not an argument against social science. It's an argument about social science can have negative consequences, and
when it's too deterministic, and it's right, that would be one. Right.
Yeah, I think that's right. I mean, yeah, there's, as you know, there's certainly different schools within social science. So
right. Thanks for the clarification. I appreciate
you're welcome.
it.
Thanks for the question. All right, last question, Emily Underwood.
Hello, hi. I was just thinking two things. One is I wanted to share, I don't know if people, I'm trying to start my video and I can't do it. Yeah, there we go. Don't know if people have read that, With the End in Mind by Catherine Mannix.
I have.
So it's a book by a palliative, it's popular, right? It's popular philosophy. It's not particularly academic, but it's written by a palliative care doctor working in the NHS, which of course is free universal healthcare at point of demand if you aren't Boris Johnson and aren't living in Britain currently, but that was, but and so it's about a good death, which I thought might be an interesting perspective for people. I won't try and represent it, I'll just recommend it. And then the question I actually wanted to ask was about I know we've talked about this in other sessions, but what you think it might say about Arendt's conception of the modern age as valuing life as the highest, with life as the highest value, when we think about the reaction that we're currently having to climate chaos, which is an obliteration of life. If we don't find a way to prevent that, we're on a road to kill ourselves as a species. And I just can't reconcile those two things with the argument that what might be defined as the height of modernity in an Arendtian conception, of science and also capitalism and pushing forward to actually kill us all. I'm stuck.
Yeah. Well, I mean, I think there's a lot of people, we can call it Earth First or radical environmentalism, right? Which sort of takes that argument, right? Which is that in order to preserve life, we should, in order to preserve life on the planet, we should either kill or restrict humans, right? Humans are the most damaging life on the planet, therefore we should kill, or what's it called? When you take out some books, you get rid of some humans in order to protect either
weeding. It's called in the library. It's a disgusting euphemism.
Weeding.
Yeah, weeding.
Yeah. So we need to weed some humans, or all humans, in order to keep life in general alive. And that's certainly part of the rhetoric of some of the more radical environmental movements. I think that obviously mainstream environmentalists don't take that approach, but they do speak of the end of life, or of life on the planet, and they think we should protect life. so to the extent, Emily, that other people, don't act as with the same urgency as some of the environmental groups, I think there's a couple options. One is maybe they really don't believe human life or life is that important, and they think there are other things. I'm not sure if that's right or not, but it could be. It could be they simply don't believe that life is threatened, or think that it's so far off in the future that it's not going to affect them. Or they just don't think about it. I don't really know the answer. But I do think that the mainstream scientific expert discourse is driven by a kind of embrace of the idea that life is the highest value, and that we need to reorganize our society in order to protect that life. And I think there's other values there as well. It's not just, life, but stewardship of the planet. Also, you could say immortality and the future of the human race. So I think there's a lot more in there than just life. I'd have to think it through more, I don't think the global warming debate is simply about life. I think it's also about the future of the human race, and all about the world we built, which is more than just life. I think
absolutely, I absolutely agree. But I wonder if it seems to me that is a version of the modern world, that we are currently living in, a version of the modern world that can be read as quite different to the one Arendt articulates, because where profit is perhaps, I'm thinking this through the conversation. It's not something I was thinking when I was reading the chapter, which is why I'm being a bit inarticulate. But it is one that is placing profit and industry above life. If you follow that if you ascribe to the argument that we need to maintain consumption of energy and products in the way that many people would advocate. I wouldn't advocate, but lots of people would.
I want to add a little bit to that, if possible. This is Alex here. I was thinking along very similar lines. So earlier, this question was coming up. Well, why are we reacting like this to what Arendt is saying? And I was wondering, could it be that what she's saying was very valid and true for the era of, let's say, the Great Society, or those big Keynesian projects in the West and totalitarianism in the East, Eastern Europe, and so on. But my feeling is, though, and just like was just been said, I think for many of us, maybe since the 80s, the 90s, since neoliberalism and postmodernity, I think there's a sense that may not be true anymore. So the ideology and the rhetoric of life first or human rights, that's definitely there. But I think many people may be seeing that that's actually not reality. And there are so many things that are coming up and that are taking, acting as a kind of highest value. I think the market is definitely one. But it's not the only one. We've had fundamentalism on the left and the right, and religious fundamentalism, so that's my sense that technology, I think, is another one, and a kind of this kind of almost like an aesthetic that seems to be almost like an end in itself, and so I wonder, what Arendt might say. Seems like she's analyzing, I guess we can call it modernist society, but I wonder how she might respond to this kind of postmodern era that we're living in.
I don't, obviously I don't know what she would say. I think there's no doubt that the principle that life is the highest good has never been absolute, right? I mean, if it were, she wouldn't have been able to write the book. She wouldn't have been able to see outside of it. And I don't think it was even close to absolute then, and I don't think it's close to absolute now. I mean, when the first question that Dina asked about COVID, I mean, the whole premise was there are many different values throughout our society. And I think that's still the case. And I think it was the case when she wrote. And I would say that counter to Alex's argument, I would say that it's only life has become even more unitary in its value in our time than it was 70 years ago. And all the trends I see are that it will continue to do so. That doesn't mean there aren't other values. It doesn't mean that there aren't times when there's a reaction against it, right? It's not like a straight line. So I think what we're seeing around the world right now is, to some degree, large pockets of reaction and resentment against a kind of expert-driven politics, one of whose goals is keeping people alive at all costs. And for many people around the world, this has led to lives that are increasingly devoid of meaning. And one can accept that when one's standard of living is going up and one can consume what one wants. But when the economy goes into crisis and inequality is rampant and many people feel that they are not doing better than they were, the economy and the consumerist aspects are no longer capable of covering over the meaninglessness of life, and people turn to other values, ideologies, movements to assert a kind of meaningfulness in their life. And I think there's no doubt that we're in a period where people are searching for values. But I don't see any one of those challenging life as the highest value. I think what you're seeing is lots of little pockets of resistance, and yet, if you look at the mainstream institutions and mainstream society, to me, it's there's no question that that's what drives most of what goes on. We could, then we'd have to get into arguments about our society, and we're happy to do it in general, but we're out of time right now. So maybe next week we're going to be talking about this more. We're going to be talking about the victory of Anima Laborans and the book. So I'm happy to revisit these questions next week. So thank you all. It's been a pleasure. This has been a great conversation, really good questions. I like the pushing back against Arendt, so appreciate that for all of you. And enjoy reading Hannah Arendt, and we'll finish this book next Friday. Look forward to it.
Hey,